Good evening, everybody. You're very welcome along to this evening's webinar. I'm just going to give it a couple of seconds for everyone to join and get connected. And Katrina, just to check, we can see that that is recording. Yeah, great. Okay, folks, well, we might get started. Welcome to this evening's webinar, which is part of a series of free parenting webinars hosted by Webwise as part of Safer Internet Day 2025. My name is Jean. I'm the National Coordinator with Webwise. I'm also joined by my colleague, Katrina Mulcahy, Project Officer in Webwise. I'm really excited and delighted to be joined by our very special guest this evening, Mark Little, who I'll be handing over to in just a few minutes. The webinar this evening will explore the topic of online manipulation. Just a few notes on housekeeping. This is a webinar format, so we cannot see or hear attendees, but we really do invite you and encourage you to join the discussion this evening. We have a Q&A function down the bottom of the screen. Please do submit your questions for Mark. We'll be keeping an eye on that throughout. And I'll just give you a little bit of information on Webwise and our project before we delve into the discussions this evening. So Webwise are the Irish Internet Safety Awareness Centre. We promote a safer, better internet for children and young people. We're funded through the Department of Education and through the European Commission, and we also make up part of the Irish Safer Internet Centre. So we work alongside National Parents Council, Hotline, and ISPCC. On the screen there, you'll see our key areas of work: developing free education resources for primary and post-primary schools that are aligned to the curriculum and tackle topics including digital media literacy, which is relevant to this evening's discussions. We engage in awareness raising, develop campaigns and coordinate Safer Internet Day in Ireland. We can't have discussions about young people or children without involving them in those discussions. So we are supported by a youth advisory panel made up of teens from across Ireland who keep us on the right track with this topic and input our resources, training and campaigns. We also offer training in CPD for schools and teenagers, so face-to-face support through our colleagues in IDGA, and we have online courses in cyberbullying, digital citizenship and internet safety in the SPHE classroom. Maybe of most relevance this evening, we have a really helpful Parents Hub and resources and information, which I will take you through towards the end of this evening's webinar. So the webinar From Misinformation to Manipulation is a conversation where we will explore what we've learned about trust and truth on the internet, from algorithmic manipulation to AI developments in technology. Techniques for online manipulation are becoming more sophisticated. To unpack this, I'm delighted to hand over to Mark and Katrina to get the conversation started. So just on introductions, Katrina Mulcahy is Project Officer with Webwise. She supports the coordination of national awareness campaigns, including Safer Internet Day, collaborates with key stakeholders and promotes online safety and digital literacy through media, conferences and professional networks. Mark Little is a journalist, entrepreneur who founded the social news agency Storyful and the content moderation company Kinzen. He also previously worked for RTE and is widely recognised for his contributions to journalism and media innovation. Mark, thanks so much for joining us, and I'll hand over to you and Katrina to get the conversation started.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jane. And as Jane said, Mark, we're really thrilled that you could join us this evening. And this is a topic that seems increasingly relevant for not just children and young people, but for all of us. And I think in the greater scheme of things, social media hasn't been really around that long. But as Jane has mentioned, now algorithms and AI are also part of the online landscape. So it's increasingly more complex, I suppose. And that idea of truth and trust on the internet, it can seem increasingly hard to find. And I know that you're going to set the scene for us a little bit on this. and tell us a little bit more about what exactly online manipulation is and how maybe tactics have changed over the past decade to where we are now.
Well, thank you, Katrina. First of all, it's just a great pleasure to be with you today. And I, possibly learn more from you as well than you might learn from me over the next sort of 25, 30 minutes. But what I thought I'd do, Katrina, because you mentioned that idea that we have seen massive changes in the way we describe this broad problem. And I would go as far as to say that we're living through a kind of an unprecedented information crisis, which looks like it changes every single day. So we all get up every day feeling like we know less about the world than we did yesterday. So I'm just going to give you a few minutes maybe to just set the scene on the history of this really big shift in the way the world communicates. And there's never been a time like it in history. It all began, I would say, around 2001 was the first year that there was more information created in that single year than all previous human history. And so this information crisis is essentially about overload. Never before have human beings taken so much information in on the daily, hourly, minute by minute basis. The previous time, I suppose, we'd had a similar crisis would have been the printing press, when suddenly people realized other people thought differently than them because they could read about it, and there was a whole convulsion in society. And this has happened in three stages, I think. And I'm in internet years, I'm ancient. So I do remember a time, many people might do on this call, where you get up in the morning, you picked up your radio and you turned it on. You had a paper of choice. You listened to the news on the radio during the day and you went home and someone like me came on, the voice of God, and gave you the news for the day. Today, obviously, your children are waking up and the first touch is to a phone. And content and information comes in them in a bit like a cloud. They have no idea where it comes from. It's just kind of atmospheric. So the change that happened was in three parts. So first of all, when I founded a company called Storyful, it was the happy days. This was about 2009, and it looked like social media was just an unalloyed benefit for humanity. It was creating the Arab uprisings. It was helping, liberate voices that had been excluded before. And it was a time, I think, when we all felt very hopeful about this internet. But there were things happening in the background that were very worrying, and that was the destruction of credibility of traditional news because Twitter and Facebook took over. And so we didn't see what was happening, but that was kind of a filter failure. The filters of information that we used to trust were starting to weaken. And the second phase then, I suppose, for me, when we were at Storyful, started to see it happening is about 2015, when we started to see governments and militant groups and terrorists using the vulnerabilities they were finding on these social media platforms to spread the supply of misinformation and disinformation. That was ways for them to flood social media with information to persuade people about the right of their cause. Now, sometimes it was just misinformation, and the distinction is this: disinformation, someone's trying to hoodwink you. Misinformation is the kind of like urban legends or the things that spread around. People say, well, it's really big if true, or I've done my research and I found this. Generally, misinformation spreads like a virus. It's not intended to deceive people. And I think we kind of got the measure of that. There was a lot of really important work done by the platforms, by governments, to try rein in the supply of dis and misinformation. There was a lot more transparency and accountability. But then the pandemic comes along and it begins what I think is the era we're living in today, which is the era of manipulation. And the distinction I'd make is this: that when the bad things were happening, the supply of misinformation was increasing. This next stage, we realized that the people wanted information that made them feel like they were part of a tribe. So the demand for misinformation, disinformation, outrage increased dramatically. And I think it happened around the time of the pandemic, when suddenly people were alone, vulnerable, suffering this convulsive shock to their lives, and they wanted people to give them reassuring, simplistic ways of understanding the world. And so what happened was then we had the rise of these influencers. They were people who were living not just on social media, but on platforms like Spotify or YouTube. And they realized that they were getting a lot of traffic the more angry they were from the algorithms. And we had this unholy trinity between the influencer, the algorithm, and this now audience of people that felt comforted by finding the influencer that explained to them the reason there was a pandemic because it was manufactured by the government, or, essentially any crazy conspiracy theory made people feel good. And that's the source of the problem that I think we're talking about this evening. A change in which the alternative media universe that now exists is so much more powerful than the old media. It's people who are not necessarily journalists. Many of them don't have real expertise, but people are being flocking to them to get information about the world that feels simple. It's why Donald Trump got reelected last November, because he had this alternative media universe that was essentially giving people what they wanted, which is a world that is simple, an identity. They're now part of a group, and this group is the only people that know the real truth. And every time that the fact checkers come for them, they're like, oh, yeah, well, you're trying to suppress the real truth because you're part of the establishment. So this is happening right now for adults, but imagine for children and kids growing up where their identities are just forming. And some people, and this is, I think we all know tonight on this call, that people who are more liable to miss this information and manipulation already have probably something in their life that's not going right. They're lonely. They're having a time in their life where they're not getting support from friends. They have some particular problem. And the influencer seems like a much more credible, trusting person to listen to and talk to. And so, therefore, obviously, we're seeing heightened manipulation of younger people who are literally finding their way and learning a new language that many of us take for granted. So that's the bad news. I'd finish off by saying I think there's some good news in this introduction, and that is that younger people, believe it or not, are way better than us at finding things about people that are not authentic when they're online. They're learning a language that's very different to the language we learned when we were younger in the analog days. They're starting to find ways of forming horizontal trust, which is different to the way we used to do it in the old days of vertical trust. We looked up to the journalists, we looked up to the newspaper to give us the truth. Now, more and more children and young people are looking to their friends, and I think their family as well, to help guide them to those places where they will need to get the information they should be paying attention to. They don't call it news anymore in many cases. It could be wellness and health and climate. And they have very different ways of discussing what we used to call news and information. And so, therefore, I think with the right support and the right encouragement, and I think our own curiosity, we will start to see younger people have new ways of building trust that I think are good news for the future. But they definitely need support right now, as I say, learning this new language. And most of all, spotting those things about a young person that might make them more liable to manipulation than somebody else. And sometimes that requires a lot more questioning, curiosity on the part of the adults in their lives, I think. And that's where I would leave it. I'll stop there. So that's my kind of quick potted tour of the information crisis from misinformation to where we are today, which I think is much more about online manipulation.
Yeah, so just like the online landscape itself, the reactions are complex, Mark, I suppose. It's interesting that you touched kind of in a couple of points there about the importance of paying attention to our emotions. A lot of what we see online is divisive. There's a lot of outrage, there's a lot of anger, but even, you mentioned maybe tapping into vulnerabilities around certain topics that maybe make people feel good, but that topic may not be something that is actually good for them, I suppose. Um, in terms of, I suppose, learning that new language, and paying a closer attention to the emotional reactions that we have. I suppose maybe give us some of your thoughts on the role that emotions play in making online manipulation more effective, in terms of, I suppose, maybe particularly children and young people.
Yeah, I think we all know, and I think maybe throw your mind back to the pandemic when you saw some piece of very innocuous or naive misinformation that happened, like the dolphins were coming back to the Venetian canals. I remember this is one I remember. And it wasn't something that went off my brain. It was my stomach. It was like, oh my God, that's too good not to share. It was that feeling we all know it in our stomach when
I think we all
it's
learned a lot from some of those messages around that time.
yeah, well, believe it or not, these algorithms, and again, algorithms are very complex, but really what they're making us do is they're sitting on our shoulder. And every time we move around the internet, they are logging on and seeing what we're seeing. And they get very good at knowing what instinctively, through that stomach, that reaction in your emotional core, gets you to look at a page quickly or share or do something. And obviously, it's primed for advertising. So it wants to make you outraged and emotional. And it's that difference between, I think, the front of the brain, which is the prefrontal cortex, the computer in your brain that makes decisions based on hard fact. And the back of your brain, what they call the lizard brain, the amygdala, which is about fear, reaction, gripping your brain. And so there are techniques that we've been using for misinformation. I like the SIFT technique, which is stop, that is, listen to your emotions. You've just seen something outrageous, happy, sad, you want to share it. And if you feel that tummy tingle, it's a good sense of something wrong. I is for investigate. Check the source. If it's someone sharing a video from Gaza and they're living in the United States, pretty good indication that they're not actually the original source there. Find the factual source then. Is can you go and corroborate what you've just seen from the set of sources that you know are pretty good, or at least all the time will give you an alternative point of view? And that triangulation can take a matter of seconds. But even the process of the friction, don't press the reshare button. Wait. Friction studies when I worked for Twitter that we did when we, had this. You saw an article you felt compelled to share, but you didn't read all of it. And we found out that when you add a little button saying, "Do you want to read the entire article?" more often than not, people stopped and paused, and it was a massive impact on the amount of misinformation we saw shared. So that's for misinformation. Now, some of that's relevant for manipulation because obviously, when you are listening to an influencer, let's say on TikTok, and they make you feel all those things I've just described, it's a good indication that they're really what they're doing is they're farming your emotion. They're actually using you to get the algorithm to send them more clicks. And so, therefore, there are some techniques that work there. But there's other things then that younger people are starting to learn that we also, I think, have to be aware of about things like affinity. Like if it's a 28-year-old talking to 16-year-olds about wellness, there's something not quite right there. If they're not transparent about the fact, let's say, that they're advising young people about their personal finances and they've got some cryptocurrency sponsorship, that's a really bad sign. Are they accountable? Can the young person ask a question and get an answer? If the answer is no, again, that's a real warning sign. And finally, if there are people who came in talking about sports, nutrition, medicine, suddenly veer off to talk about the elections, again, changing lanes is another good way of noticing when an influencer is just chasing clicks or is something wrong with that. So there's some of the techniques that we know work in misinformation that are transferring over to this new kind of dimension. And also then learning from young people themselves about what they value and how they decide to trust things. And again, in the age of attention, it's not the quality of your information, it's your ability to harness emotion. And that's, I think, a really important thing to remember.
Yeah, I think that phrase about farming your emotions, I think, is a good one to keep in mind. I think when you're online and you're consuming on information, and I suppose we've talked a little bit, or you've talked a little bit about the differences between children and teenagers who are typically, they're digital natives and many of us are not. And it's interesting to hear about those differences between how they react to online manipulation and navigate those challenges and many of those things that you pointed out that we can learn from them as well. But one of the big differences, I suppose, is that typically young people are getting their news from social media rather than traditional news outlets. And like you mentioned, it brings challenges, and not just with news, maybe with good causes and things like that. But there are also a lot of good sources of information on social media too. So I suppose how do we help them to develop those skills to be able to tell bad information from good?
I think it's very important for us to stop kind of using phrases like social media to describe the entire internet as experienced, let's say, by my son who's 17, because he doesn't see it social media. He'll kind of laugh when I say that, because for him, I say like, well, Snap is for messaging. YouTube is my TV station. And he might say, well, I've just seen something about Gaza. And I said, where'd you get it from? Oh, a friend. But no, it's a BBC video. Oh, yeah, but I got that from my friend. And so when I start describing social media to him, he's like, well, wait a minute, like this is just the water I swim in. Like, I don't know where this all thing. He will use Reddit for some particular community he's really interested in. And he might go on to podcasting because he's a rower, he's an athlete. So he'll listen to like 3 hours of someone talking in his ear about something he really cares about. So I think when you look at this social media from the perspective of the younger person, you realize it's not one amorphous group of things happening. It's very different. And the really good news is that young people are consuming more of what we used to call news and information than before. They're also paying for news they trust more. The higher rate of paying for subscriptions, donations to news and information organizations among younger people than older people, believe it or not. So there's this really interesting positive trend. But again, to the point we were making earlier on, you then start seeing certain categories of younger person drop away. Young men, for example. We know that young men right now are feeling in many ways lost. They are
Yeah.
not as good at talking to their friends as girls and women are. They don't tend to go with a huge problem. And the more society has an open conversation about things like mental health, I think the more young men feel alienated from that. They also know that thanks to the progress made for women in education, they kind of feel in some ways, in some countries, we're seeing this, that the level of achievement by boys and men is dropping. And that's why, for example, in Germany over the weekend with the elections, the biggest divide in that country now is a gender divide. Men increasingly voting for the far right, and women increasingly voting leftwards. And so there's this opening up. And I think that's a really interesting example of how there are particular groups that are falling into rabbit holes in this massive fragmented environment that are not readily apparent to the eyes of a person my age or the age of the people on this call. And I think that's where the kids are generally okay. Believe it or not, they're getting better. But again, these particular groups that fall without noticing into really terribly dangerous, violent, and dangerous environments. That's, I think, where we need to be learning a lot more.
And I think, there was a recent report from the European Movement Ireland, the disinformation landscape youth in Ireland and the EU. And to your point, it explored, I suppose, trends around disinformation and youth in particular from active clubs, who are a growing network of far right activists. And I suppose we also see it with the rise of the manosphere and controversial influencers too, tapping into those vulnerabilities that you spoke about. Um, I suppose, are there any effective approaches, do you think, that we could consider in terms of helping to reach those vulnerable groups, or to, I suppose, to try to mitigate against that?
Well, the first thing is, I think a marker, one of the common denominators across all groups of young people that are at risk is loneliness. The feeling that they're kind of on their own, and obviously increasingly in those 20 years, and we know there's a parallel concern about smartphones and the impact on mental health for teenagers. Clearly, Jonathan Haidt's book is a very important book in that regard. But similarly, over in this area of online manipulation, it's also the same thing with loneliness. So I think as a parent, the first thing you can do is be curious and full of questions that are not challenges to your child. So, for example, during the pandemic, with our kids, we would sit on a Saturday night and we'd ask them for new music. So on the speaker, we'd all go around, they bring new music to us. And there was a great collaborative sense of that. Even within our WhatsApp group, we would be sharing things during the week. Finding a way with your children to be curious and ask questions of things that you know are markers of loneliness, radicalization. So, things begin, for example, with sports. I mean, a lot of, as you say, young men are being radicalized through interest in sports nutrition, in particular, like my son was talking about the Stoics, which is a particular rabbit hole, like, teaching men to exhume pain and be warriors. And when you talk and ask questions of your son or your daughter, you start to hear where they're coming from. You start to know if they're lonely, if they're vulnerable, if they found a gateway that you spot, that you know leads somewhere they shouldn't be. And that curiosity is so important. I think the second thing I would say is make sure you and your child know that you have power. You have power to unfollow. You have that power to report. You have power to leave. You have power to ask questions. I think, increasingly have power to train the algorithm. So if you're getting more and more, let's say on Instagram, a particular topic that's troubling you, the algorithm has found you. Now, if you can teach the child to go, I actually don't feel comfortable here, but more and more of this, it looks like reality to me because I'm seeing so much of it. that's when they can start doing things to the algorithm to stop. Whenever they're served a video, they get out. They don't click, they don't go any further. And so I think those kinds of behaviors you can teach. Final part, there's one across all of this sphere, misinformation manipulation, which is working, is pre-bunking. So if you know that a specific theme is a gateway for a particular form of manipulation, and you go to your kids and say, listen, you're going to see this argument made, or you're going to see this kind of person who's going to manipulate you. And what you're doing is you're planting in their heads an ability to something to go off in their brain as soon as they see a particular type of messaging behavior by an influencer. So pre-bunking and preparing on your knowledge of this particular rabbit hole someone might fall down, those things that they should spot. And, they may not initially think about it, but if it's in the back of their brain, the statistics are showing us, the data and research is that pre-bunking is just uniformly a positive in preventing people being radicalized online. So again, this requires us as parents and teachers as well to share. And I think this is where civic society has to start working to share more information about where vulnerable groups might fall victim to influencers and what are the common language techniques
Mm.
uh, that are used by these influencers to grab people and preparing our children to have that sort of back of the head instinct to go, oh, I know what's going to happen. Around events, we see, for example, political events, we see riots, etc., where we know there's going to be the same message again and again from a manipulative group or radical group or a violent group. Preparing your children for the messaging that they're going to see is hugely important. But most of all, as I say, curiosity, making people feel powerful, and finally then giving them the ability to learn this language with your help. Because I think that's what we are talking about. The internet is a new language which changes all the time.
Yeah, and I think that's really, really good advice because I think, that there is so much going on that and it can be overwhelming at times to try and be able to judge what is accurate and what's reliable. And also, not to get too caught up in the idea that maybe children and young people navigate the space a little bit differently to how we do. But I think, the advice that you've given is really good in terms of practical ways to be able to try and bridge that gap and have those conversations. More generally, I suppose, Mark, and I'm conscious of time. What do you think kind of needs to be done, I suppose, to make us all more resilient against online manipulation, and I suppose in particular, help and support for parents to help those, yeah, I know we've touched on it a little bit, but to develop those critical thinking skills to be able to identify manipulation online. We're in a very complex space at the moment, which I imagine will only become more complicated. So, your advice and I suppose insights into that.
Well, I think there is definitely need for us all to be united in the right kind of regulation in this area. And I would distinguish the right kind from the wrong kind by saying this. Safety by design is something, and I worked within um, organizations' platforms. And what that means is if you make an algorithm more transparent and accountable, rather than dictating, like what's the outcome here, but just ask the platform, what's in that black box? What kind of data are you training? How does that algorithm work? So we in Europe are very lucky to have a Digital Services Act. And over the past couple of weeks now, the Code of Practice on Disinformation, which I was honored to be part of working on, which essentially is saying, tell us how you make big decisions about content. Make sure that we can register when someone makes a complaint. Make it really easy for an ordinary person to make a complaint, to ask for something to be taken down, be very transparent, accountable. That works much better than trying to ban certain kinds of speech, safety by decree. So let's get our politicians focused on really good legislation we have here in the European Union, resisting the trend that's happening right now in the States. Keep the pressure on the platforms to work with fact checkers and to make sure that there are sort of ways of collaboration. I think it's really good that these community note systems that you see on X, and now I think Facebook's going to talk about them. They're great because they're kind of collaborative groups of people that are like Wikipedia. They get together and quickly decide if something requires a fact check. And I think they're good systems to work. So we're now going down to decentralizing then the powers back down to the individual. And I think if we can, civil societies and teachers and organizations like this and events like this tonight, is to start working on constant ongoing research on what areas of this vast fragmented internet we are on where there are specific problems right now. And it's a kind of like tracking the weather, but also identifying not just the threats, but the people that are doing best practice. So I see more and more in podcasting, which is an area that I know very well, new behaviors that are very positive by influencers that are not journalists, but are being taught skills. Like when they start an investigation, you hear more and more in a podcast. We're going on a journey right now. We're not sure where it goes. If you're affected by anything that you hear in the podcast, send us a message. And these open-ended kind of investigations and narrations and series and influencers that are constantly looking for the community to be involved. I think we should be encouraging that kind of behavior, responsible creators. And I'll give you an example. I mean, the Two Johnnies, which is a very popular podcast, not everyone here probably listens to it. They did a recent investigation on catfishing in the GAA. If you listen to them, that was a textbook example of they didn't identify people. They were aware of the psychological impact on individuals. They didn't name people. They didn't make sure that it wasn't salacious in the same way a tabloid investigation would have been. So let's encourage young influencers in our midst to start to take a respect for their audience very seriously. And then finally, as I say, let's, if we can, give um, some framework to parents to, create a WhatsApp group with your kids and start just sharing things with each other during the day. Have you seen this? Did you see that? Hey, something's happening over here. And find ways for us to collaborate with our kids in a way that doesn't feel that like, I don't know about you, but like growing up, like that music's terrible. Get your hair cut. Don't go down there and talk to that person. That's the exact opposite. The more important thing is tell me about how that makes you feel. Like, what's your favorite podcaster? Where do you get your news from? Did you know that there's the BBC or the RTE? And I think it's that sort of area where perhaps almost like a language, where's the resources for that for the parents? I would love that as well as a parent teacher meeting where I go in and I meet this teachers telling me how my kid's doing. Is there a place for parents to go in for a orientation meeting about what's the conversations likely to be happening on among your children that are all focused around social media platforms like that? So as you can tell, I'm pretty much I'm not the guy to dictate the thing that will happen in terms of legislation or government action, but we should be aware that there are good things happening. Kids are gravitating towards smaller communities based on their activities. They're keeping people out that are manipulating them. So encouraging the trends already in play among young people who are forming trust based on transparency and accountability and affinity, better behavior by influencers that are now the new 9 o'clock news, basically, and then for parents, I think more support from civic society, education, and obviously then the more regulatory environment as well to make us all feel empowered, have agency, not feel like we're trapped and powerless. That's the most important thing for me.
Yeah, I think that, and like you said, that whole of society approach is really important, and I think it's really good to, I suppose, to highlight those positive aspects that you mentioned as well, Mark, because it could be very easy to get overwhelmed and maybe demoralized by some of maybe what we see. So it is important to keep those positives in mind too. I am conscious of time, and I think some questions have come in. And if you have any more questions for Mark, we'd encourage you to put them into the Q&A. But I know Jane is just going to come back in now as well with some brief information on WebWise resources and some tips as well for parents.
Yeah, thanks for that. Mark, just in your discussions there, you reminded me a couple of years ago we hosted our National Safer Internet Day event. RTE showed up with a very well-known correspondent, a very familiar face. Our youth panel weren't familiar with him, but they followed the cameraman that was with him on TikTok and knew him very well and were very excited and getting selfies with him. So I think perfect example there.
It's great.
So, but I'm just going to just a reminder of some of the resources available from WebWise and advice and information for parents. Online safety is a busy, broad space, and sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming, but there are lots of helpful resources and supports out there. So just a couple of reminder steps. You can familiarize yourself with all the free resources and supports. Get started by visiting the WebWise Parents Hub. You'll find expert advice, how-to guides, explainer guides, start the conversation. I think the most important thing parents and families can do to support their children and young people online is by having good relationships with them, engaging in conversations, checking in. I love that idea from Mark about establishing that family WhatsApp group to share information and to have the chats as well. Agree rules and guidelines. Children and young people do need guidance on guardrails in relation to using technology, and also need help with switching off and turning off in the evenings. These devices and social media, are vying for our attention. We find it hard to switch off as adults. So it's really important that we're putting in and helping develop healthy digital habits and expectations around use for social media, and instilling our own family values as well about respect and being kind online and looking out for others as well. And WebWise and the National Parents Council have great family agreement templates that can help you guide those discussions and make agreements. And we'll share links for all that towards the end. Encourage your child to come, to tell you about what's going on if something happens or something goes wrong online. And you can't say this enough to children or young people. Always remind them if something happens, they can come to you, they can talk about it without fear of judgment, embarrassment, shame, or, even if it's a case they pestered you to get a game that you maybe weren't happy about, or, begged you to get their first smartphone, something's happened and went wrong, and they're worried about how you might react. Things do come up, so just to let them know that you are there for them, and they can come and have the chat with you. Of course, our children and young people learn from the adults and grown-ups in their lives. So it's important that we are all, as educators, as parents, as aunts and uncles, are leading by example. So to model good behavior, and if we have rules in the home, that we're following the rules ourselves as well, and setting that good example, and that we're all making time to switch off in the evenings and kind of do stuff together as well. And last point, join in. The internet is a great resource. Myself and Katrina were on a webinar earlier, and somebody was telling us about this bird noises app where you can identify all different bird songs from around the world. There's so many brilliant things, games, apps to explore online. So to sit down with your child and young person in your life to get to know what they like about it as well. The resources you can find available on the WebWise Parents Hub. I'll share links to that. We have a parents guide, a topic generator. Our partners in the Safer Internet Centre, ISPCC, have a brilliant digital ready hub. National Parents Council run an excellent helpline and training for schools as well. And a reminder that WebWise are also part of the Media Literacy Ireland network, which is a network dedicated to promoting media literacy, and do some brilliant work in this space and have great advice and tips. Again, we'll share a link to that. But we might just jump back into questions now. We have a good few questions here to get through. First one, Mark, love the SIFT framework. Could you just remind us what each letter stands for? And I think I'll share a link in the chat to that as well.
So it's stop, have that pause of friction, investigate, check out what you can see about the source, and then find the credible information. Essentially, check it with someone you really do go to the bank with in terms of your information. So like BBC, RT, etc., the public broadcasters. So that's the way to do it. But even the process of just stopping and letting yourself sit for a moment, I think that's the most important part of that. And it just assumes that you do know somewhere to go that's credible. And I think that's the missing piece for younger people. They're not quite sure. And that's why I was really, what you just said about, set a good example. Like it might be good to think about, like, knowing the three or four sources that you think your kids might like. Like the Journal Investigates is a brilliant service. I think it needs a subscription. So maybe like you have a donation at Christmas for that. Or find a Substack, Substack's a great platform, newsletters, etc. So I think they may need that help at the end to have the last part, the F and the T.
Yeah, brilliant. And I've shared a link to a BBC article kind of breaking that down a bit as well. You kind of touched on the regulation piece, the DSA, the code of conduct. It was fantastic that you were involved in the development of that. We, of course, have an online safety framework here. Are regulators in this jurisdiction, do you feel, doing enough to protect children from harm? And are their rights being upheld?
I think Ireland is particularly well equipped in this particular area of misinformation manipulation. Because of the Digital Services Act, we have this like European Digital Media Observatory, which is run out of DCU. I know the people there, they're like world leaders in this area. So I think that's really incredible. I do also think that the most important part of the Digital Services Act in this code of practice is getting researchers into the platforms, which is, I think, the number one problem we have right now. Like, I remember Frances Haugen, who was a whistleblower at Facebook. She made a really good point. There's probably no more than a couple of hundred people in the world who know how these platforms work. So that's the weakness right now, is getting good researchers from universities, from civil society inside the platform. And that's the area right now I think that's weakest. And also, all the platforms are pulling back from their fact-checking responsibilities under that code. And, Europe right now doesn't necessarily seem to be pushing back against the platforms. And I think the Irish government has a big role to play there, given that the DSA doesn't make us the front line here, like with privacy, but, Ireland definitely has an oversized responsibility, given all the tech platforms are here, to be the mediator to help the platforms hopefully get back into line with the DSA. Remember, European rules will become international standards if our politicians have the commitment and we do push for researchers to get in there.
Thanks, Mark. And I shared a link to the Edmo Ireland Hub, which is a fantastic project as well, part of the European Edmo hubs. And I'll also share a link into the Code of Conduct. And for an aspiring journalist, what advice would you give to somebody who's interested in pursuing a career in journalism?
Get on those platforms right now. Get yourself a really good TikTok account. Get yourself a newsletter you write every week about something you love. Find your own authentic weirdness. Like, what's the thing you know more about than anybody else? And you'll find a community online that will trust you. So yeah, I mean, I look at, if I was starting in journalism today, I wouldn't apply for RTE. Now, don't tell RTE I said that, but I love public broadcasting. I really do, and supported it very strongly. But if I'm a young journalist, I want to start out by finding a community. The future of good journalism is an individual serving a community and the community talking back to that individual rather than, being the person on the telly. And so if you're really interested in sports, find the thing that you know more about than other people and then write for a community who'll talk back to you. And I think that's the beauty of the internet. There's going to be a lot more really good people who don't call themselves journalists, like, but do the job that used to be reporters in the past. So yeah, there's so many different places. I'm advising a company that now this reimagining foreign correspondency, connecting with communities. So that's where I get excited by the opportunity of someone who might be 20 years old coming out of a college, going straight to work or out of school. Just find your community, find your tribe, and write for them.
And I think you're a good case study, Mark, for different journeys and starting up different things as well, with Storyful and all. Um, Another one on the tech firms and big com is the only realistic solution to the vast amount of disinformation that companies, big tech companies, promote, to treat them as publishing companies and make them legally responsible for disinformation promoted on their platforms.
You see, again, I think this is the difference between the right and the wrong kind of regulation. Every piece of regulation creates an unintended consequence. So, for example, the debate we're having about child safety, having verified child ID, IDs and ages, etc. Like, if you do that at the Apple store, that might be good, but if you do it anywhere else, it causes huge problems for privacy. In this case, we have a very clear American influence, what's called Section 230, which says platforms are not liable for everything on their platform, just too much of it there. If we enforce that publisher definition, the platforms could never, ever do anything but just ban everything that was problematic. They did it at the beginning of the pandemic. You could not say words like Jewish because they just didn't want anything that could be interpreted in any way controversial. So the suppression of free speech that will be required to do that would be so great. It would have a backlash. It would create martyrs out of these people that were suppressed, and it would be the wrong thing to do. The right thing to do is radical transparency. Because right now, it's a bit like the financial crisis in 2008. The banks lost control of all these products they had built. That's what's happening right now. So the real solution is if you are going to recommend content with an algorithm, you must be able to show how it's trained, how it works, and what happens when it goes wrong. And it's that safety by design, fixing the system rather than trying to decree an outcome by looking back to a definition from the old days. That would be my feeling on it. Now, again, it's not to say that we don't have more pressure there, but yeah, my experience has been every new fantastic feature of the internet creates a bad thing, and every legislation trying to cure the bad thing can create its own unintended consequences. So let's be very careful about safety by decree and focus more on safety by design.
Thanks, Mark. And I think we'd support that as well. For us, robust regulation that is works and is enforced, good safety by design, digital literacy from an early age, and evidence-based policies. Those are kind of, uh, where we would see it as important. I have a few more questions if you bear with me. I would like to get to everyone's questions this evening. I think a lot of people are interested if the webinar is being recorded. It is, and we will send out a recording to everybody. I'm going to share the code of conduct. Any advice re data protection policy development for school? I think this might be one I could take, Mark. I'm not sure if you'd
I'll throw it to you.
have any views on it. We have the DPC Data Protection Commissioner did publish guidance for schools on data protection. I don't know, Katrina, if you might be able to see if we can share the link with that if it's up on their website. And Webwise also have developed an online safety review tool that is a free tool to help school leaders, educators, to review their policy and practice. And there's a data protection section in there as a filtering section, cybersecurity, curriculum involving parents. So you're presented with different statements and resources to help you on your journey as well. So we can share links to that as well. Um, and then, sorry, I'm just going to. Okay, yeah. So the one final question here: what should I expect from policymakers, and what is their role, or is it up to me as a parent to deploy these techniques to identify and mitigate against the techniques used by powerful third parties? So I suppose that balance between who has different responsibilities, what can parents do?
Well, I think the first thing is to basically see where you can report. Like there's a lot of things we can do on privacy, for example, that the platforms make it very hard to do. So, there's lots of how-to guides on the internet about how to block the platforms for surveying you for certain purposes. Similarly, in the case of reporting content for whatever reasons, like the mechanisms are there today. The problem is that you don't know how that report really gets treated. Now, the Digital Services Act, and I can tell you right now, being inside platforms, they are much more concerned about having to build that structure because it can be a huge fine if they don't. And they're trying to build it right now. Now, the problem I think is they're backtracking a little bit because the pressure is off them in the States. So, where the political pressure comes in is first and foremost, report. explain, find out. Like you can see platforms like Instagram, there's a fairly well-defined idea what you're reporting on. Keep the pressure up on why you haven't heard an answer. If it's not explained to you, again, that's a contravention of legislation. And in the end of the day, the pressure on the politicians has to be if you as a parent are not getting what you need from that complaint process, well, then we have to bring that back to the politicians, unfortunately, because the platforms themselves will exploit any loophole they can find, and they kind of are at the moment. So yeah, I'm sorry to say that the empowerment part of this does put a lot of responsibility on us, and at some point, then we have to be going back to our politicians on a local level to make this a big issue. We have good regulation. It's not perfect, but we've got better regulation than anywhere in the world. That's a nice balance between protecting from harm, having transparency and accountability, and also finding things that are really about violence and creating harm in society. So let's put the pressures on our politicians, not to create new things, but to make sure we enforce the legislation regulation that is there, and actively use those features. Like, one of the things the platforms don't show you is you have a lot of power underneath the hood. So get used to the ideas of how you can filter. The final thing I would say is there is a new form of social media coming called decentralized social media. Platforms like Blue Sky, Mastodon, they're not massive right now. But what they do is they're giving more power to users to control their own content moderation. So setting, filters of words they don't want to see, or reducing the level of anger in their feeds, and a lot more power. And that's, I think, the way of the future is decentralizing power to us as citizens to control the environment we're in. That will be a solution for the concerns people might have about freedom of speech being quashed, is if all of us can decide what's our tolerance on the internet for anger? What's our tolerance for ideas that are shocking to some and are definitely not shocking to others? Let us make those decisions as citizens. And I think we're not even halfway there with this new regulation we have. But I think decentralization of social media, when you have the power to walk away from, let's say, an email provider, you still talk to the old email list you had. Similarly, those things are happening in the background. And I'm really hopeful that they will help us feel much more empowered as citizens and not have to rely on ringing up the local clinic, the politician to put the pressure on the government. But for now, that may be the only thing to do.
Thanks, Mark. I think that's a really exciting prospect as well, and a nice note to end this evening's webinar on. Just a reminder, we put a link in on webinar feedback. We'd really appreciate your feedback to help us improve our events and look at what other topics you'd like us to explore.
Hey, maybe could I just throw in a book recommendation that I
Yeah,
think at the moment is really good?
please do.
Book called Invisible Rulers, and it's written by an internet researcher called Rene DiResta, Reneedi, Oresta. She's just written this book, and it's probably, I think, the best current summary of all this, and it's written very approachable. And she's been in the middle of all the wars about this topic herself personally, so it's also a bit of a personal testimony. But I highly recommend that.
Thank you. And just before we go, I'd like to pop a link into that into the chat as well so people can access that too. Um, I think we'd all agree this evening's conversation has been absolutely fascinating. I really cannot thank you enough, Mark, for giving us your time, your knowledge and expertise. You can see from the range of questions there is a big appetite to understand this more. And you've such a brilliant way of communicating to help unpack this as well. And, expertly led by our colleague here, Katrina, as well. So thanks so much, Mark, for your time this evening. I know I
I
really
really
enjoyed
appreciate the
this.
work you're doing and the platform you've given me, but also I hope I meet some of the people who are in this chat room at some point in the future. If I could be any help, obviously in the future, I'd love to be. But thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for joining us this evening, for engaging in the conversation. We will send on the recording of the event. Thank you to Katrina. and we will share links. If you have any further questions or comments, you can get in touch with us directly on our website. Thanks very much, everyone, and good night. Enjoy. Thanks.
So I will say goodbye as well, but
Thank you, Mark. We will be in touch for sure. Thanks a million. Good night.
not at all. Thank you. Bye bye.